We've been spending the month of April during the Easter season exploring questions about the historical Jesus and what meaning and significance we can find in the gospel stories yet today. Well, today we're going to finish our focus on Christianity before moving on to a more, shall we say, interfaith theme for the month of May. And every so often, I get to address a question that I get from people who are new to unity, something they want to know about unity, something they want to know about me, and the question usually goes like this. The person says, well, you're Christian, aren't you? And they say it like that. They say it in such a way that you just know that they're expecting one and only one answer, a simple and resounding yes. But if you know me, that's not what they get. I can only answer a question like that with another question, which is, how do you define Christianity? That's because many people who self-label as Christian have these very specific requirements that you have to follow in order to be considered Christian. And each denomination has slightly different standards, in case you haven't noticed. They have different rules, different standards for what it takes to be called a Christian. Some are totally non-negotiable, like the exclusive divinity of Jesus, or the resurrection, or the second coming at Judgment Day, and things like that. But George Carlin, here he is, George Carlin once said that there are only 3 religious truths. And here they are. Number 1, Jews do not recognize Jesus as the Messiah. Number 2, Protestants do not recognize the Pope as the leader of the Christian faith. And number 3, Baptists do not recognize each other in the liquor store or at Hooters. It's a fact. Those are the 3 for sure and for certain religious truths. Beyond that, it's all up for grabs. Confusion reigns supreme. Don't you think it's time to move beyond labels? Don't you think it's time to move beyond the kind of tribal mentality where we have a checklist that we use to determine who's in and who's out? Because that's how it works. And even for those folks who have some very rigid beliefs about who gets to use the Christian label or not, I can guarantee that they pick and choose the parts of the Bible that they follow, and they ignore other parts that are inconvenient or uncomfortable. They're sometimes called cafeteria Christians. You know what happens in a cafeteria, right? In a buffet line. They proudly wear the label of Christian. They claim to be Bible believers and to follow it completely and literally. But in truth, they pick and they choose like someone going through a buffet line. They take a little bit of this, they take a little bit of that, but if they don't like broccoli or rutabaga or whatever it is, they leave that behind. They ignore what doesn't correspond to their preconceptions, and especially their political beliefs. Talk about something that's non-negotiable for a lot of people. Here's a great example. This picture up here shows a man with a very elaborate tattoo on his arm. Okay, I'll try to read it for you. It says, you shall not lie with a male as one does with a woman. It is an abomination. Okay, what that tattoo is saying is that homosexuality is an abomination. And I will tell you, I have seen this kind of thing on more than one person, on their arm. One guy I know had it on his leg. And the thing that's really interesting about that, okay, that's from Leviticus 18 in the Hebrew Scriptures, the book of Leviticus, chapter 18. In the very next chapter, chapter 19, guess what it says? You can't make this stuff up. You shall not make any cuts on your body for the dead, or tattoo yourselves. I am the Lord. So tattoos are an abomination as well. But guess what? Cafeteria style, they ignore that part of it because they really, really like tattoos. Especially those judgmental tattoos where they get to display their bigotry to the world. It's amazing. It's amazing. Priceless. Priceless. Here's another part of the Bible that a lot of folks who self-label as Christian would prefer to ignore. And that has to do with what Jesus had to say about wealth and possessions. Jesus was not a capitalist. Jesus did not support the acquisition of wealth or possessions. If you want to hear a little bit about how the earliest followers of Jesus, the earliest Christian community, led by Peter, who was the successor to Jesus, at least according to the Gospels, here's how they operated according to the author of Acts of the Apostles, who, by the way, is the same author who wrote the Gospel of Luke. Here's the description. Now, the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as owned land or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. They laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as had any need. Interesting. Now, a little later on, there's more to the story here. A little later on in the next chapter, it tells the story of a couple named Ananias and Sapphira. They were a couple who wanted to join this early Christian community, but they held back some real estate instead of turning it over to Peter like they were supposed to. The penalty? Death. They both dropped dead right in front of Peter and the rest of the community, and they were ceremoniously hauled out by the young men as a warning not to withhold anything. Acts of the Apostles, giving you the citation in the handout. You don't hear these passages very often, do you? And yet that's how the early followers lived. That was their economic system. Communism. Everything owned in common. I'll tell you, if Jesus and his followers were here in America in the 1950s, they'd have had to pay a little visit to Senator Joe McCarthy, don't you think? But today, everyone appears to have forgotten about that. It no longer applies. Why? Because it's inconvenient. It conflicts with what is most popular and comfortable in our culture, our capitalist system. And that's fine. But just don't claim to follow the Bible literally, okay? Don't try to tell me over here in Unity that we shouldn't interpret the Bible because every word is from God and is literally true. If you don't take it all literally yourself, why can't I interpret the Bible? I was actually talking to someone, this was a few years back up here in Auburn. They were curious about Unity. Told them I was a minister and we had a center over here in town, and he asked, well, do you have any Bible classes? And my face lit up and I said, well, yes, because it just so happens this very night I'm teaching a class in Bible interpretation. You know, the Unity Bible interpretation class that I know a lot of you have attended. And his eyebrows go up. And he says, Bible interpretation? He says, God meant every word that God said. I don't see that it takes any interpretation. Which was the signal for me to shut up. I decided not to pursue the issue because that is not an invitation into conversation at that point. But what I wanted to tell him is nonsense. I would have used another word, but nonsense. Everyone interprets the Bible. Everyone interprets the Bible. Sometimes, they ignore so much of what the Bible says that they claim to follow literally that I wonder if they really, really still think it's relevant. If they really think it's still viable and relevant. Another example, Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes. Jesus very clearly said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Also talked about what you're supposed to do if someone strikes you on one side of the face. You're supposed to offer them the other side as well, so on and so forth. If this is truly a Christian nation, like I hear a lot of people insist, I would think those teachings would be the foundation of our worldview. And it's clear that they're not, because we are bellicose. We cheer for more missile strikes, and we make excuses for why we can't be peacemakers. And that's okay. There may be perfectly valid reasons for those things, but just don't claim to follow the Gospels and insist that everyone else follow your interpretation of those Gospels. I'd like to hear them at least acknowledge that they're engaging in cherry picking. They want to be exempt from the rules that we all have to follow in society if they happen to conflict with their interpretation of their scriptures. They want everyone else to comply with their notions of morality and sexuality based on the Bible, but only on their terms, and they get to ignore whatever it is they please or find inconvenient. But don't you dare try to interpret the Bible. Oh, God meant what he said, every last word of it. Then they wonder why young people don't want to go to church anymore. They wonder why their numbers are dwindling. The old ways are crumbling under the weight of their own hypocrisy. People are seeing it, and they're deciding to move on from that kind of Christian doctrine and that kind of tribal mentality that drives that whole thing. But the question is, what is there to move on to? And is there a bridge that might help people to get there? I think a lot of times people need something to help make the transition, a way to maybe redefine and to reframe traditional beliefs, take the next step on their own personal spiritual evolution. And fortunately today there are some groups that are charting a course for people to learn how to do that. And I'd like to think that it all started with Charles and Myrtle Fillmore back in the late 1800s. If you read any of their works, you're going to notice they continued to use very traditional sounding Christian language in their writings. They were leading a revolution. They were trying to give people that bridge. And it was a gentle and very non-violent revolution, which I think is best summed up by this quote that I like to use. This is from back in 1895. Charles Fillmore said this: "We have been readers among all schools of thought, and we find good in all of them. We do not claim to have discovered any new truths, nor have had any special revelation of truth. There is truth in every religion. It is my privilege to take truth from any source, put it into my religion, and make it a fundamental rule of action in my life." 1895. And if I may dare interpret a little bit of what he's saying there, what he's saying, I think very clearly, is that they weren't just making stuff up. He and Myrtle Fillmore weren't just making stuff up, claiming some new version of Jesus was giving them a new message. No, that's not what they were saying. He's saying that they were engaged in a process of studying the works of well-known spiritual teachers and philosophers throughout history, and then doing something that's very important. They were testing those teachings against their practical experience in daily life. That's very different from the kind of cafeteria style of doing things that I mentioned earlier. The Fillmores were engaged in a rigorous search for objective truth, not just the things that validated their personal opinions that they already held, Big difference. And whenever I use that quote, I always point out something very important. Fillmore is not saying that all religions are true. Something I've noticed in unity circles, in recent years, I guess, is this suggestion that all religions are really the same. And it's just not true. You can find similarities, you can find some consistent teachings, but there are plenty of things that are contradictory and inconsistent. What I think we can say about all or most religions and philosophical schools is that they're all trying to answer the same set of questions. They're all wrestling with the same questions. The answers might be very different, but we're dealing with the same questions. They're the kind of questions that we often call ultimate questions, and I've got 7 of them here this morning, which were adapted from a book called Thank God for Evolution by Michael Dowd. And so these are the 7 ultimate questions. I'm certain there's more, but this kind of gets at the core of it. So question number 1, who are we? That's the question of our identity. Do we believe in human dignity? Do we believe in the essential inherent worth of human beings? Or are we worms in the dust, worthless sinners who need to be saved by some outside entity? That's number 1. Number 2, where did we come from? The question of origin. Were we created, or did we evolve via natural selection? Number 3, why are we here? That's the question of purpose. Is there a purpose that's being imposed from the outside, or is purpose something that is up to us to discern for ourselves? Number 4, this is the big one. How are we to live? It's the question of ethics and right action. How we answer that question might decide the ultimate fate of humankind. Number 5, where are we going? The question of destiny. Will the world end with a divine judgment day, or are we going to have to stake out our own destiny and make that happen for ourselves? Number 6, what ultimately matters? That's the question of meaning and values. Is it the same for everyone, everywhere, or can we allow for circumstances of culture and geography and still find a way to get along? That's the important one. Still find a way to get along. Number 7, what happens when we die? The question of finality and continuity. Is this our one and only life? And how we answer that question could have a lot to do with the urgency that we bring to the process of working out these questions. Over the years, I've talked from time to time about this trend where people say that they're spiritual but not religious, right? You've heard that? It's trendy to say, I'm spiritual but not religious. And after years of hearing that, I've reached a tentative conclusion about why that's happening. I think people are trying to move away from traditional religion because that kind of religion says that those 7 questions have already been answered conclusively, absolutely, and once and for all by their sacred books, their prophets, whatever, all of them thousands of years old. They even have a bumper sticker that you still see on cars today, which goes like this: God said it, I believe it, that settles it. Take those 7 questions and, that's kind of what they're saying. But if you like bumper stickers, here's a better one. Good ideas don't fit on bumpers. Good ideas, important questions don't fit on bumper stickers. So anything that stands in the way of new ideas, anything that stands in the way of good ideas or stands in the way of asking those kinds of questions we just talked about, and then following the evidence. Anything that stands in the way of that is an affront to human dignity and freedom. And I think it's time for the world to move beyond bumper sticker religion and start taking ownership of those all-important questions once again. And Christianity and the other great religions of the world are not a lost cause when it comes to helping us do that. There's wisdom there. There's guidance, the collected wisdom and guidance of the ages. And there are also cautionary tales about the kind of things that you don't want to do when dealing with those questions. It's still there. It's still of value. So working with those questions, I think, is an essential part of being human, and we'll continue to take a look at those from a different perspective, moving beyond religion altogether, and we'll take that journey beginning next week. Thank you.